Recently, ElderWatch conducted a research survey on the financial habits and questions of Coloradans 50 plus. In this video series, we're going to answer some of the questions that came out of this study. My name is Jess Zawodzki. I am the program specialist for ElderWatch Colorado. Thank you for joining me. Today, we'll be talking about budgeting. Today's prompt comes to us from a 64-year-old retiree. They said, I would like to learn more about budgeting because I've seen how some of these kids can budget. They utilize their computers or social media and they can budget easily. It looks so easy, but to me, it's still a task. It's not as hard as it was, but I would like more information on different ways to budget, especially because I'm going to be Medicare age next year. So today we'll talk about 4 different budgeting strategies, and we'll also talk about 2 debt reduction strategies. Before we start, one of the things that this respondent alluded to was computer tools related to budgeting. At ElderWatch, we can't recommend a particular budgeting tool, but a good place to start may be your bank, especially if you primarily use one card or account and you have the app or access to digital banking. Often your bank will have an option to help track your spending and show you how much you tend to spend in each category. From here, you'll have a starting point to understand your current spending, which will hopefully make implementing the strategies we're going to talk about easier. Additionally, you'll notice that many of the strategies that we're going to talk about are more about how you think about money and allocating your money. That said, there is no one-size-fits-all solution, and you may need to tweak some of these strategies so that they work best for you, or maybe you'll implement 2 of these strategies. The first budgeting strategy we're going to talk about is the pay yourself first method, and this method is very simple. In this method, as soon as your income hits your bank account, pay all your bills and necessities first, even if they're not due yet, before you spend on non-essentials or things that can have a more flexible budget. So let's look at an example of why this simple strategy can be very helpful, especially if you're guilty of sometimes overspending in non-essential categories like dining and entertainment. So let's say your income is $4,000 a month. You plan to spend $300 on groceries, $300 on dining and entertainment, $200 put into your savings account, $200 into an emergency fund, $1,500 for housing, and you have about $1,500 in monthly bills. Now let's say you don't use the pay yourself first method. If you don't, you might accidentally spend $350 on groceries and $400 on dining and entertainment. But you still have to pay your rent and bills. So when that's done, instead of having $400 total for your savings and emergency fund, you now only have $150. Or perhaps, let's say, you put money into your savings and emergency fund first, but you hold off on paying for housing and bills because those bills aren't due for another 2 weeks. If you then overspend still on dining and entertainment as well as groceries, this might now mean that you don't have enough left over to pay your bills. And as a result, you might have to withdraw from your savings, which means that you're losing out on the compound interest from leaving that money alone. The 50-30-20 rule is similar to the pay yourself first method, but it involves breaking up your income differently. This strategy involves directing 50% of your income to needs, 20% to savings, and 30% to your wants. So if we take that fixed income from the previous slide, if you were to use the 50-30-20 method with that income, you would be setting aside $2,000 for your needs, $800 for savings, and $1,200 for your wants. Now, in this model, needs include things like housing costs, bills, insurance, etc. And some people will also count paying down debts in the needs category. Savings would include putting money into a high-yield savings account, or depending on where you are in your working life, this may also include putting money into your 401k or your IRA. Alternatively, some people will include paying down debts in the savings category. You can manually set these contributions when your income hits your account, but this is another strategy where automating your payments will be very helpful. One critique with this method is the percentages involved, and they can be a great guideline, but they might not make financial sense for every situation. Some people might say that 30% is much too large of a chunk of your income to go into wants. And some people will say that you need to think about your goals when you're setting those percentages. For example, if your want for the paycheck is to go to a fancy restaurant, that's a very different amount than the want of perhaps helping to pay for your grandchild's tuition. Additionally, if you're struggling with debt or worried because you don't have an emergency fund, you may want to allocate less toward leisure spending and increase your savings or needs budget. Employing the zero based spending strategy requires more intensive planning on a fairly regular basis, but even though it's a little bit more intense, it's kind of the easiest one to explain. Zero based spending just means that you plan every dollar of your budget so that when you're finished, there are $0 left. One difference in this philosophy generally is that you will also review how you did last month so that you can more accurately gauge this month. With the previous two methods, we're generally thinking about putting things into pretty broad buckets. So, for example, in the pay yourself first method, you have one bucket that is just wants. In this method, we're even parsing out the wants very explicitly so that we get a better picture of our spending overall. Additionally, in this budgeting strategy, one potential difference is that we are allocating every single dollar and giving every single dollar a job. We are not leaving any money unallocated when we do the zero-based spending method. And the concept here is that by giving every dollar a job and thinking about it on a really granular level, that we have to confront our goals, confront our priorities, and confront how we make our money work. And that by doing so, we're changing the way that we think about spending and our spending habits in general. Now, I will say, once you make these allocations, you can definitely adjust them as the month goes on. Surprises and unexpected events, of course, happen, and each month is probably going to be a little bit different. For example, you might be spending on different things in August than you are in February. So let's look at a mock version of the zero-based spending model using our previous income of $4,000. First, we'll want to allocate money towards needs. So let's say that we plan to spend $300 on groceries, $1,500 on housing, $50 on internet, $50 on our phone service provider, $175 on credit card bills, $120 to utilities, $150 to health insurance, $40 to life insurance, $200 to an emergency fund, $200 to a high yield savings account, $300 for car payments, and $200 to car insurance. This totals $3,285 and leaves us with $715 for wants. So next, we'd lay out all of our more discretionary budget items. Let's say every Monday you go bowling and it's $25 a week, so it's $100 a month. Then let's say you go to trivia once a week and you spend about $20 there, so that's $80 a month. Every Sunday, you host dinner for your family, and the extra expenses are $40 a week, so that's $160 per month. Some weeks you treat yourself and you get takeout once a week, but sometimes you really don't want to cook, and so you get takeout 2 or 3 times a week. So you set your budget to be about $200 a month on takeout. Then there is your gym membership, which is $50 a month. You, on average, spend about $40 getting your hair done. You spend $35 on streaming services like Netflix and Hulu. You spend $20 on beauty and or skincare products per month. And then you like to treat yourself to coffee from time to time, so you allocate $25 for that. This totals $710 and leaves you with $5. Now, you might be just tempted to just leave that $5 alone. After all, it's only $5. What does it matter? But this is the big difference with zero-based spending. It forces us to think hard about how we make every single dollar work for us. So in this case, all right, if you're going to employ this model, you have to figure out where to put that $5. So maybe you put it into an emergency fund, or maybe you make an extra $5 payment towards a credit card. Maybe you want to start giving a charitable donation, and so you plan to start small by donating only $5. And this is again why people like this model. It forces you to think about the details of how you spend your money down to the last dollar, and by doing the legwork of making all of these calculations in the beginning of the month or the pay period, you don't really have to think about it later. Now, this model also kind of highlights why it's really important to have an emergency fund as part of your planning. Because if you do have an emergency fund, even though you've made all of these really specific plans and allocations, you can now just take out of that emergency fund instead of having to reconfigure your entire budget to accommodate the emergency. The envelope method is generally a cash-based budgeting model. In this model, you will withdraw your money for the month or whatever time period you choose in cash. You will then physically put the cash into literal envelopes based on what it's for. So, for example, when you go grocery shopping, you will only take that grocery shopping envelope, and that's the only money that you'll use. Theoretically, you can use this method in conjunction with some of the other methods we've discussed. So, for example, if you're using the 50-30-20 method, you could take out the 20 or 30, whichever percent you choose for your wants, put that cash into an envelope, and so then you only spend the money that's in that envelope. When it is gone, you're done. With the zero-based spending model, you could, again, put grocery money into that envelope or your Monday night bowling money into that envelope, and then that way you're not overspending. Now, to some, this method may seem a little old-fashioned, but part of why I like this method is that it helps protect us from a number of cognitive biases that come up with spending. One of these is called cashless bias. And this is the idea that people spend less money when they have to pay for things in physical cash, and they spend more money when they have to pay for things on a debit or credit card. This is very, very, very similar to a cognitive bias called pain of payment, which is the idea that we have more negative emotions when we physically have to part with cash, and we have less of these negative emotions when we pay for something with a cashless method. And so in this way, we spend less conservatively when we're using a card. In fact, purchases using a cashless method have actually been shown to increase spending by 38%. So again, that's why this method is great, but also why and how it can be used with some of the other budgeting strategies that we've discussed so far. Now, the strategies that we've discussed so far are specifically around budgeting, how to divvy up our income so that we're not overspending or, in some cases, missing payments. But if debt management is your primary financial goal, we might look at things a little bit differently. So let's say you're using the zero-based spending strategy, you've allocated for your minimum credit card payments, but after budgeting out everything, you still have $20 left over. Now, remember, with that one, you have to allocate every single dollar. So you decide you want to put that money onto credit cards. But if you have 3 different credit cards, how do you decide which one to put that money on? This is where the Snowball or the Avalanche strategies for debt repayment come into play. The Snowball strategy says that you should put that leftover money onto your smallest balance first. This method provides quick wins that build momentum and motivation, but may result in paying more interest over time. Now, the Avalanche method suggests that you put the remaining money onto the account with the highest interest rate and focus on paying off that account first. And that's a wrap for today. If you need more help with your budget, especially if your expenses are more than your income, consider contacting a financial coach. Here in Colorado, most counties have a free financial coaching program, and in Denver, this program covers all of Denver County and a couple of surrounding counties as well. This program is called the Financial Empowerment Center. They offer free financial coaching, and you can definitely get in touch with them to help you implement one or more of these budget strategies. If you're not in Denver County, they can probably also help you find a similar program in your area.